She accidentally signed to the Vampire King's mute daughter during a royal banquet. The entire room stopped breathing. The goblet fell in slow motion. It slipped from Celine Thorne's trembling hands, crystal catching the glow of hundreds of floating candles overhead. Time seemed to warp, stretch, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. When the glass struck the marble floor, the crash shattered the illusion of silence. Red wine splattered across the banquet hall like spilled blood, blooming in jagged lines across the pure white linen tablecloth and the delicate hem of a pale child's dress. Gasps echoed. Chairs scraped. The quartet silenced mid-note. Eyes turned. Hundreds of them, noble vampires, ancient and cold, swiveled toward the source of disruption. Celine stood frozen, tray still in her hand. Face drained of color. Her stomach flipped. Her mind screamed at her to bow, apologize, vanish, anything. But her gaze, her foolish human gaze, locked onto the girl. Princess Alarielle Varec, the mute heir, the ghost child of the night court, draped in ivory silk, skin as pale as snow, eyes heavy with centuries of silence. She hadn't flinched at the wine. She hadn't moved at all. She just stared at Celine. Not with anger or fear, but something else. Something curious, lonely. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. We'd love to know how far our stories are reaching. And if you're enjoying this emotional fantasy tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. We post new romantic vampire stories daily. And you won't want to miss what's coming next. Celine dropped to her knees without thinking, frantically trying to blot the spill with her apron. But her hands didn't reach for the wine. They moved in the air, sign language. "Are you okay?" she signed, a gesture she hadn't used in nearly 6 years. Not since her cousin passed, not since she'd buried that part of herself with the person who'd taught her. And yet here it was again, rising from her like a ghost, a kindness that slipped past her fear. Alarielle's eyes widened. Her mouth opened just slightly, not to speak, but to breathe. Then her fingers lifted, slowly at first, then quicker, more assured. She signed back. Yes. A moment, a smile, and the entire room recoiled as if lightning had struck the dais. Alarielle was signing, smiling, responding. It was the first expression she'd shown all night, maybe the first in years. Even the nobles, ancient and stoic, whispered in disbelief. Celine blinked. Her hands fell to her lap. Her heart thundered in her ears. And then he stood. From the throne at the far end of the banquet hall, carved from obsidian and draped in velvet, Varec, the Vampire King, rose to his full terrifying height. Silvery blonde hair cascaded down to his waist like a blade of moonlight. His black robes moved like smoke. His eyes, twin storms of frost and fire, locked on Celine. Her lungs forgot how to work. This was the king who had ended wars with a word. The king who hadn't been seen weeping since the death of his queen. The king who ruled by silence and whose daughter had followed suit. He took one step forward. A ripple of fear swept the court. A dozen servants fled. Even the guards stiffened, as if unsure what came next. Celine didn't move. She couldn't. Varec's voice, when it came, was low, commanding, unmistakable. "Bring her to the East Wing. Assign her to the child." Murmurs exploded around the hall. Celine's stomach dropped. She expected exile, a lashing, a public execution maybe. But this? The East Wing was royal ground, forbidden to humans, off limits even to most nobles. Alarielle turned to her father, her face neutral once more, but her hands still rested in her lap, twitching with signs only Celine had seen. Varric didn't look at his daughter. He looked only at Celine, like a hawk watching a mouse that had somehow learned to fly. That night, the palace corridors whispered with rumors. The human girl who made the silent princess speak. The king who spared her. No, claimed her. And the shadows, always listening, leaned in closer. Because in a palace built on silence, the smallest sound could echo for centuries. And in a kingdom ruled by blood and fear, a human's hands had just started a revolution. The silence after the king's command hung in the air like fog. Celine's knees ached against the marble. Her hands were still in her lap, as though the sign she had made, "Are you okay?" had frozen them in place. Her breath came in shallow waves. All around her, noble eyes followed her like sharpened daggers. "Get up!" a steward hissed in her ear, tugging her elbow hard. She rose slowly, not daring to speak, not daring to look at anyone, not even the girl, especially not the king. They didn't return her to the servant quarters. Instead, 2 guards led her, wordlessly, through a winding series of halls she had never seen. Darker, colder. The air smelled of lavender and old stone. No light filtered in through the towering stained glass windows, only moonlight. The candles flickered blue. When the guard stopped before a carved ebony door and opened it, Celine stared. It was a suite, a royal suite. No cot, no shared bunk beds, no scent of mildew and unwashed linens. Instead, the room was draped in deep sapphire curtains, silver-framed mirrors, and a fireplace carved with runes. They didn't speak, just left her standing there, stunned, shoes still soaked in wine, and closed the door behind her. She stood in the silence for a long time. By morning, the castle was a different place, not in architecture, in energy, where once there were passing smiles and nods from the kitchen staff. Now there were stiff backs and averted gazes. 2 housemaids whispered when she passed them in the corridor. "She's still alive?" "For now." A tall butler in black paused just long enough to mutter, "You're being watched," then vanished down the hall. Celine couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. When the knock finally came at her chamber door, she thought it might be her end. But instead of a guard or a blade, it was a pale-haired handmaiden. "You're to accompany the princess to the gardens." That was all. No greeting, no emotion. Celine followed in silence. The royal gardens were unlike anything Celine had seen in her life. Moonflowers glowed in clusters along the gravel path. Trees with dark crimson leaves shimmered like blood in water. The air pulsed with quiet, not stillness, but something deeper, waiting. And at the center of it, seated on a stone bench beneath a twisted silver tree, sat Alarielle Varric. She looked smaller without the banquet dress, more like a child than the marble figure from the night before. Her hair was brushed to a glimmering shine, her ivory robe pooling around her feet like liquid snow. When she saw Celine, her face remained blank, but her fingers twitched, then lifted. "You came." Celine blinked. It wasn't a question. It wasn't hesitant. It was relief. She stepped closer, kneeling carefully in front of the girl. "Of course I came," she signed. The girl's eyes sparkled. She straightened slightly, hands already moving faster than before. "Do you know stories?" "What kind?" Celine asked, smiling. "Funny. Dragons. Sad." "Yes, all of them." Alarielle grinned, a real grin, toothy and bright. Then in a flurry of fingers, she began to sign so fast Celine could barely keep up. Her signs were imperfect, clearly unused for years, but the meaning poured out. "I used to sign stories with my mother before she died. Father doesn't like to talk. Tutors left. No one signs. I forgot how. Until you. Celine's heart clenched. It wasn't the words. It was the flood behind them. The dam that had broken the moment someone finally listened. She moved to sit beside her. "We'll make up new stories," she signed. "Yours and mine." Alarielle nodded furiously, then froze. Her gaze drifted up, over Celine's shoulder. Celine turned. A figure stood on the upper terrace, cloaked in black, half shrouded in shadow. King Varric, watching. His face gave nothing away. Celine turned back, hands hesitant. "Does he always watch you?" Alarielle didn't answer right away. Then she signed slowly. "Only when I'm with you." That night, Celine returned to her suite, no longer fearing death. Now, she feared something far more complicated. She feared the attention of a king who ruled without mercy, and the affection of a child who had just begun to believe in the world again. And in between them both, she sat, human, alone, unarmed, except for her hands. The gardens became their sanctuary. By the second morning, Celine no longer needed an escort to find her way. She slipped through winding, velvet-draped corridors and out into the cold moonlight, where marble statues watched like ghosts from behind hedges of silver-blossomed thorns. And always, there was Alarielle, waiting, seated on the stone bench beneath the twisted silver tree. The same place, the same stillness, but not the same child, not anymore. Now, she smiled when Celine approached. Her hands would lift eagerly before Celine could sit down, signing in bursts, clumsy, joyful, like someone who had waited too long to be heard. Celine made a habit of introducing one new sign each morning: joy. She signed slowly on the third day, brushing both hands upward from her chest. Alarielle repeated it. Once, then again, faster. Joy. They sat knee to knee in the frost-kissed grass, signing under the moonlight like conspirators in some ancient wordless spell. Safe, Celine showed her next, then friend. Each one seemed to light something in the girl's expression, like stars blinking on in a night sky that had always been too quiet. They played games. They told stories. Alarielle would sign a random object, bat, book, apple, and Celine would have to spin a tale on the spot, acting it out with her face and body, hands flying wildly in the air. The little princess would clap silently, shoulders shaking with laughter. Laughter. Not a sound Celine had ever expected to hear from a royal vampire child. And though it didn't come from her lips, it rang louder than any voice in Celine's memory. Some nights, they sat in stillness, communicating without signs at all. Just eyes, just company. Celine didn't know how much time passed in the garden, only that each day the world outside the gates felt farther away. And each day the silence around Alarielle felt a little less like a prison. But they were not alone. Not really. The king was always there. Not in the garden, never that close, but above, distant, watching, sometimes on the terrace, sometimes behind a window's sheer curtain. Once, Celine glimpsed him standing in the shadows beyond the hedges, unmoving as a statue. He never interrupted. He never spoke, but he was there. She could feel him, like a chill in the wind that wasn't quite cold, like lightning before a storm. One afternoon, Celine paused mid-story. She had been signing something ridiculous, a tale of a vampire kitten who wanted to be a knight. When she felt it, the pull. A sensation at the back of her neck, like a gaze carving across her skin. She didn't turn her head. She just leaned closer to Alarielle, kept her hands low between them and signed slowly, Is he watching us yet again? Alarielle's face didn't change. She simply lifted her hands and signed, "Only when I'm with you." Celine blinked. Her chest tightened. She looked up, and this time she found him. On the high stone balcony. 3 stories above, he stood like a painting etched from night. Varek, the king. His long silver hair stirred in the wind, and his black coat rippled behind him. He didn't lean on the railing, didn't move, but his eyes were locked on her, not the child. Her. Celine froze, unsure what to do. Bow, look away, pretend she hadn't seen him. But something in her blood refused to flinch, so she held his gaze. 1 heartbeat, then another. The king's face remained unreadable, a mask carved from frost. And yet, something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, not disdain. Something else, something ancient and exhausted. Then just as suddenly, he turned and vanished back into the shadows. Celine released the breath she hadn't known she was holding. Alarielle was watching her, expression unreadable. Celine signed, only half joking. "Should I be afraid?" Alarielle tilted her head, then shook it, and signed, "I think he's lonely." Celine didn't sleep that night, not because she feared punishment, but because she was beginning to understand something far more dangerous. The princess wasn't the only one who had been silent for too long. Absolutely. Below is chapter 4 of your story. Deeply atmospheric, emotionally layered, and building the political tension while preserving your romantic fantasy tone. The summons came with no ceremony. A single page, black wax seal, pressed with the insignia of the High Court, slid beneath her chamber door while she slept. Celine had known it was coming. The moment she locked eyes with the vampire king on that balcony, she'd felt it coil behind her like a storm waiting to break. Still, her hands trembled when she unfolded the parchment. Report to Chancellor Valerius in the Hall of Glass, immediately. No explanation, no title before her name, just cold ink on colder paper. She dressed in silence and walked the halls without escort. None of the other staff dared meet her eyes. A maid carrying linens paused as she passed, offering a tight, pitying glance, the look one might give a ghost before it vanished. The castle felt different this morning. Heavy, watching. The Hall of Glass was nothing like the name suggested. It wasn't warm or crystalline. It was a throne of frost, a long corridor of black marble and arching mirrors, all set to reflect power back at itself. Columns of carved obsidian lined the walls, and in the center of the far end stood Lord Valerius, draped in crimson and gold. He didn't rise when she entered, didn't greet her, didn't blink. Celine bowed, stiff, awkward, not knowing the protocol. The doors shut behind her with a sound like judgment. "You are bold," Valerius said, voice like razors wrapped in velvet. Celine said nothing. He circled her, slow and deliberate, like a serpent gauging the shape of its prey. His hair was bone white, but his eyes burned ember red, not with fury, but with calculation. "You speak with your hands. You ignore station. You linger where you were not summoned. And now..." He stopped in front of her. The child smiles, laughs, expresses. A pause. A dangerous distraction indeed. Celine's breath caught. Distraction? She is heir to the throne. She is pure-blooded, descended from the first Fang. Her silence has been her protection, her shield. You, a human servant, are unmaking that. "She's not a statue," Celine said, voice low. "She's a little girl. She deserves nothing." Valerius cut in sharply. "She is owed loyalty, not freedom. And you are owed obedience, not opinion." He withdrew a second parchment, laid it on the table between them. A transfer order. "To the southern kitchens," he said. "Permanent. Immediate." Celine stared at it, the words blurred. "That is all," he said, turning his back to her. "You will depart before moonrise." The doors opened behind her without sound. Dismissed, erased. Celine walked back to her room as if in a trance. She didn't cry. She couldn't. She folded the transfer order in perfect halves and placed it on her bedside table, then sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the fireplace until the embers died. She thought about the garden, about Alarielle's hands fluttering with stories, her shoulders shaking with silent laughter. She thought of Varric, still as stone, eyes like winter fire watching them both. And then she thought of the silence again, the way the palace had welcomed it, the way it had needed it, because silence was easier to control. That evening, she was led to the garden one last time. Not by summons, by memory. No guards stopped her. No servants interfered. Perhaps they thought she was already gone. Alarielle was waiting beneath the silver tree. She smiled when she saw Celine, but that smile faltered instantly. The girl's eyes searched her face. Her hands lifted. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Celine's heart twisted. She crouched in front of her, searching for the right sign, the right lie, but her fingers refused to move. Her throat burned. Alarielle's hands fell slowly back to her lap. "I knew it," she signed. "They always leave, the ones who listen." Celine's chest cracked. "I don't want to," she signed back. "But they're making me." Alarielle didn't cry, didn't frown. She just turned her face away and stared up at the sky. Celine sat beside her. The silence returned, but now it was colder, heavier. She didn't sleep that night either. She sat at her desk, staring at the transfer order for hours. She thought about survival, about fear, about knowing her place. And then, just before dawn, she stood, took the parchment in her hands, walked down the long corridor, turned right instead of left, and entered the Hall of Glass for the second time. Lord Valerius was there, waiting, as if he had known she would come. "You've chosen wisely," he said without looking up. Celine stepped forward, held the parchment up. Then, without hesitation, she ripped it in half. Once, twice, until the pieces fluttered like falling ash to the marble floor. Valerius stared at her, and for the first time something shifted in his expression. Not anger, disbelief. "You think the king will protect you?" he asked softly. "I'm not here for protection," Celine said. "I'm here because your heir deserves someone who sees her." She turned, and that was when she saw him. Varric, standing in the archway, cloaked in black, half in shadow, expression unreadable, but not unaware. He had heard everything. Celine's breath caught, but she did not bow. She didn't look away. And the king once again held her gaze for a long, long moment. Then he turned and walked away, cloak billowing behind him like a storm cloud at the edge of dawn. The castle was different at night. It breathed quieter. The corridors no longer echoed with footsteps or whispered politics. The velvet drapes hung heavier. The moonlight cast longer shadows. Even the wind seemed to tiptoe between towers like a thief avoiding notice. Celine wandered these halls not out of rebellion or curiosity, but because she couldn't sleep. Not after what she had done. Not after the king had witnessed it. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the silence that followed her defiance, or the fact that he hadn't punished her for it. She didn't know what she expected. Retribution? Exile. Instead, nothing had happened, which made it worse. She turned a corner she hadn't meant to, and froze. The grand doors of the royal library stood cracked open, something she'd never seen before. Light flickered from within. Firelight. Celine hesitated only a moment before curiosity pulled her forward. She stepped inside. The royal library was not what she imagined. There were books, yes, thousands, bound in leather, stacked from marble floor to vaulted ceiling. But there was no dust, no silence. The hearth at the far end burned low, casting shadows across velvet lounges and silver-threaded tapestries. And in front of it, seated in a high-backed chair, cloaked in velvet, was Varek, the Vampire King, alone. She should have turned around. She should have bowed and fled and never looked back. But something in the way he sat, not regal, not stiff, held her there. His elbows rested on his knees. His head was slightly bowed. One gloved hand clutched something in his lap. A photograph. Or a painting, maybe. Too small to tell. He didn't speak. Didn't move. Didn't even flinch as she stepped softly forward, firelight warming her cheeks. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice low. Not angry. Not commanding. Just tired. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Silence. Then, "Neither can I." She moved closer. Now she could see it. The image in his hands. A portrait. A woman with long raven black hair. Eyes like polished amethyst. Pale skin. A smile that had no fear of the future. Celine didn't need to ask who it was. She knew. "She died protecting the city," he said, eyes never leaving the painting. "When the gates broke, when the fires came, she fought while I was elsewhere, negotiating treaties, making speeches." His jaw tightened. "She stayed behind with Alarielle." A pause. "She died in front of her." Celine sat down across from him without asking. He let her. "She didn't speak for days after," he continued, quieter now. "Wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. She'd just stare. And when she finally moved her hands again, no one knew what she was saying." His voice cracked, just slightly. "The tutors failed. The court lost patience. And he swallowed. "I buried her mother. And then I buried everything else." Celine watched the fire reflect in his eyes. "She didn't forget how to sign," she said. "She just forgot what it felt like to be heard." At that, Varek finally looked at her, and she was struck again. Not by his power or his beauty, or even the way his presence filled a room without trying, but by his exhaustion. By the pain that sat behind his pupils like a wound that had never closed. "I don't know how to raise her," he admitted. The words were so soft, Celine barely caught them. "I don't know how to be a father to a child who doesn't speak. Not in words, not in court, not like me." "You don't have to speak the same way," Celine said gently. "You just have to listen in the way she needs to be heard." He blinked, slow and deliberate, like he was hearing it for the first time. "Silence," she continued, "is not weakness. It's another language. It's another kind of strength." A long beat passed between them. Then she lifted her hands, moved her fingers slowly, deliberately. "Daughter." The sign hovered in the space between them like a fragile bridge. Varek watched her hands. His brow creased. She did it again. Then reached across and gently guided his gloved fingers into the shape. Open hand on the chin. Pull downward. "Daughter." He followed her motion with trembling hands. "Daughter," he whispered aloud, the word almost foreign on his tongue. He stared into the fire, then again. "Daughter." His shoulders trembled. Celine said nothing more. She didn't need to. Some griefs couldn't be softened with words. Only with presence. Only with understanding. only with the fire between two wounded people who still weren't entirely sure if they could be whole again. That night, Celine returned to her room without incident. No guards, no whispers. But in the royal wing, behind thick velvet curtains, a man who had ruled for 300 years dreamed for the first time in a decade. In the dream, his wife stood by the garden. She signed the word, home, and behind her, in the distance, he saw his daughter signing too. Laughter in her eyes, joy in her hands. Between them stood Celine, and when he reached for her, she turned to him, not with fear, not with reverence, but with light. He woke before sunrise, and on his lips, unbidden, her name. Celine, the lessons began in silence, not the kind that loomed or punished. This silence was different, intentional, curious. Every evening after the castle had gone quiet, after the last torch was dimmed and the watchmen took their posts, Celine would return to the library, and Varek would already be waiting. No guards, no attendants, just a king in shadows, seated near the fire, his coat draped over one shoulder, sleeves rolled up, palms bare. Again, he'd say simply, and she would teach. The first time, she taught him hello and good night. The next night, thank you and safe. Then came more complicated signs. Worry, angry, proud. He struggled at first, not because he was incapable, but because his movements were too stiff, too practiced. Centuries of war, ruling and stillness had made his hands weapons, not instruments of tenderness. But Celine was patient, and something about her patience made him try harder. By the 5th lesson, he no longer asked for repetition. He just watched her hands and mirrored them, slow, deliberate, reverent, as though every word she gave him was a key to a door he hadn't opened in years. One morning in the garden, Varek joined Celine and Alarielle from a distance. He stood in the shadows of the ivy-covered archway, close enough to observe, far enough not to intrude. Celine signed brave to Alarielle, who giggled and tossed her a playful scowl. Then when Celine wasn't looking, Alarielle's fingers fluttered quickly in a teasing blur. Varek raised an eyebrow. Celine turned just in time to catch the end of the sign. "What did she say?" Alarielle shrugged innocently. Celine narrowed her eyes. "Come on, tell me." With a little grin, Alarielle signed again, slow this time, exaggerated. "Father likes you." Celine flushed. Varek didn't move, didn't speak, didn't deny it. And that was worse than confirmation, because it meant maybe. That evening, the lesson didn't take place in the library. It took place in the moon garden, the one where Alarielle first spoke again. Varek had requested it. Celine arrived at the edge of the hedges and found him there already, standing by the white stone fountain, the moonlight painting his hair silver, his expression unreadable. She approached slowly. "I thought we were reviewing signs for home tonight," she said softly. He nodded. "We are." But he didn't sit, didn't gesture, just stood there, staring up at the stars. "I haven't been out here since..." He trailed off. Since his wife, since the war, since everything froze inside him. Celine waited. He finally looked at her. "You've brought something back," he said. She tilted her head. "To the garden? To me?" A pause. He stepped closer, only inches now. The air between them grew still. And then, with a tenderness that felt dangerous, Varek reached forward and brushed a strand of hair from Celine's face. Not possessively, not like a king touching something he owned, but like a man touching something he didn't quite believe he was allowed to want. Selene didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. His hand lingered, just for a second, before dropping. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. The tension thrummed louder than thunder. By the end of the week, the whispers had begun. She heard them in corridors, behind cracked doors. The king meets with the human woman at night. She's teaching him her tongue, her touch. He favors her over the court, over us. Lord Valerius's name was on many of their lips. Selene didn't respond. She kept to her lessons, to her time with Alarielle, to the signs and the stars. But she felt the shift in the wind. The court was no longer amused. It was watching her now, not with curiosity, but with intent. The spring festival had not seen rain in over 2 centuries. Tonight the skies held their breath, cloaked in violet clouds and glowing starlight. The palace was dressed in gold firelight and scarlet banners. Music from crystal chimes floated on the breeze, and nobles from every corner of the kingdom filled the grand square outside the royal balcony, dressed in silk, velvet, and skepticism. But above them, behind the towering doors of the East Wing, tension hung heavier than ceremony. Selene stood at the threshold of the private hall, just beyond the marble archway that led to the royal balcony. Her heart thundered, not because of the crowd, not even because of what Varric had asked her to do, but because of what it meant, because of what it would cost him. Lord Valerius had nearly torn the council table in half when the announcement was made earlier that day. You would allow her, the girl, to stand before the realm? He hissed. A human, beside your daughter, in front of the high bloodlines? Varric hadn't flinched. She is the reason Alarielle speaks again, the king said. You will honor that. She is an outsider. She is family. That shut them up, but it didn't silence them. Word had spread, and tonight, eyes weren't just watching the royal line. They were watching Selene. Inside the high-ceilinged antechamber, Alarielle paced in a circle, not out of fear, but energy. Her hands fluttered, repeating the phrases Selene had helped her prepare. I am not broken. I am not silent. I only needed someone to listen. Slower, Selene signed gently. Remember, they've never seen this before. Every word is a star. Let them shine. Alarielle stopped pacing, nodded, exhaled. Varric watched them from near the window, cloaked in black and silver, his expression unreadable. But his eyes never left Selene. A soft knock, then a guard appeared at the door and bowed. It is time, Your Grace. Varric turned. Selene took Alarielle's hand. The child squeezed it. Not out of fear, but solidarity. A signal passed between them that needed no sound, and together they stepped out. The balcony opened to a vast sea of people, nobles in front, civilians beyond the outer gates, their torches flickering like stars on earth. Gasps rippled through the crowd the moment Selene appeared. And when they saw Alarielle, standing tall, dressed in midnight blue, eyes bright and hands poised, silence fell like a sword. Varric stepped forward first. His voice was like smoke and thunder, cutting through the hush. My daughter, he announced, will address the realm. He gestured beside him. And this woman will translate her heart. He didn't look at Valerius, though the Chancellor stood near the back of the balcony, face carved in furious stone. Instead, the king nodded to Alarielle and stepped aside. The moment stretched. Alarielle looked out at thousands of eyes that had never seen her speak, that had whispered behind fans and scrolls, calling her defective, cursed, doomed to silence. She lifted her hands. The first sign, I am not broken. Selene spoke it aloud. I am not broken. Alarielle continued. I am not silent. Celine's voice was strong, clear. I am not silent. Then the final sign. I only needed someone to listen. Celine swallowed the lump in her throat. I only needed someone to listen. Silence. Heavy. Total. Then, in the crowd, a single hand lifted. A woman, elderly, dressed in healer's robes, mimicked the final sign. Listen, another joined. Then a child. Then a soldier near the steps. Hands began to rise like blooming flowers across the courtyard. Slow, awkward, imperfect, but trying. Celine turned just enough to glance at Varric, and for the first time, his mask cracked. Not visibly, not in a grand gesture, but in the way his shoulders lowered, in the way his jaw unclenched, in the way he breathed. Then Varric stepped forward, lifted his own hands, and signed 2 words, not to the crowd, but to Alarielle. My daughter. The child's eyes shimmered. Celine whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear. He said, my daughter. A murmur spread, then a bow. First from the front line of nobles, rigid, reluctant. Then from the outer circle, more fluid, reverent. Until the entire courtyard lowered their heads, in silence, not as dismissal, not as judgment, but as recognition. The ceremony ended without fanfare. No drums, no horns. Just the echo of what had been spoken without sound, and the weight of a new beginning. Back inside, the hall emptied quickly. Only a few remained. Celine, Alarielle, and Varric. The child leaned against her father's side now, head resting lightly on his arm. His hand hovered uncertainly before settling atop her crown. She signed something to him, a word Celine couldn't see. But whatever it was, it made the king smile. Soft. Real. She's never stood like that before, Celine whispered. Varric looked up. You didn't give her words, he said. You gave her wings. Celine blushed. He stepped closer, just enough to close the space between them. And for a moment, there was no balcony, no court, no kingdom. Just a man and a woman who had seen each other in the quiet, the kind of quiet that healed, that redefined strength, that turned shadows into sanctuary. The silence after the balcony speech did not last long. By dawn, the whispers had become knives. By midday, they were weapons. And by nightfall, they became demands. The court summoned an emergency assembly. The Night Court's oldest bloodlines crowded the Obsidian Council chamber, their cloaks dragging like shadows, their fangs politely hidden behind smug smiles and centuries of entitlement. Celine was not present, but every word was about her. She is a human, Lord Valerius hissed. And worse, a servant. You would risk the purity of the royal line for a commoner with soft hands and too much heart? She influences your daughter, another noble added, voice sharper than his jeweled cane. She speaks for her, speaks to you. That is not affection, Your Grace. That is control. Varric said nothing at first. He let them rage. He let them burn. And only when the chamber fell into uneasy stillness did he rise, slowly, deliberately, and say, She is not my servant. His voice was ice over fire. She is the reason my daughter smiles. No rebuttal came, because no one could argue with the truth of it. Celine didn't hear the speech until hours later, whispered from a sympathetic kitchen maid, passed from the walls like sacred gossip. She said nothing, not even when Alarielle signed. Are you okay? Celine only nodded, too stunned, too full, too uncertain to speak. That night, the moon was high and sharp as a blade when a royal messenger knocked softly on her chamber door. "The king requests your presence," he said, and nothing else. She knew where to go. The garden, always the garden, the place where silence first broke, where hands first spoke, where change began. The moonlight drenched everything in pale silver. The stone bench, the frost-laced grass, the marble fountain that never ran dry. And beside it, cloaked in darkness and thought, Varric. He did not wear a crown. He wore no armor, no velvet, no titles. Only a black tunic, his hands bare, his expression unreadable. He turned as she approached. "You came," he said softly. Celine didn't answer. She stopped just a few feet away, heart pounding, waiting. "I've never asked anyone for permission to do anything," he said. "Not in 100 years. Not for war. Not for treaties. Not for the throne." He looked up at her, voice raw. "But I'm asking you now." Celine swallowed. Varric stepped forward. "I am not a gentle man," he said. "I have ruled with silence and shadows. I've buried a wife. I've failed a daughter. I've killed for less than a whisper." A pause. "And yet, I have never been more afraid than I am right now." Celine's breath caught. "I could offer you power," he said. "A throne, immortality, the adoration of a kingdom." His hand hovered near hers, not touching. "But none of it matters unless you choose it." The wind stirred the trees. The moon carved his features into something sharp, and yet wholly human. "If I gave you eternity," he asked, voice barely a whisper, "would you stay?" Celine blinked. Her throat tightened. Tears gathered, but didn't fall. "Only," she said, "if we spend it loving." She reached up, touched his face, just once. "Not just surviving." He didn't speak. He stepped closer, closed the final inches, and kissed her. Not with hunger, not with dominance, but with reverence. Like she was something he never believed he could touch again. A human kiss. A vampire's promise. A vow made not with rings or oaths, but with blood and choice, and something older than both. Above them, in the far window of the royal wing, a small figure watched from the curtain and smiled. Alarielle's fingers moved in the dark, shaping a single word. Love. The crown was nothing like Celine imagined. It wasn't golden, it wasn't jeweled, it wasn't even heavy. It was forged from starlight silver, etched with the ancient crest of the Night Court. And when Varric placed it gently on her head, it didn't feel like a symbol of rule. It felt like belonging. The throne room stood in reverent silence. Thousands had gathered. Nobles bowed low. Soldiers stood tall in ceremonial formation. Every servant who once whispered of her fate now clutched their hands over their hearts. Not out of fear, but pride. Alarielle stood between her father and Celine, dressed in sapphire velvet, her silver circlet glinting under candlelight. When the High Seer asked if the new queen had words to share, Celine turned first to her, not the court, and signed. "You speak first." Alarielle's eyes widened. A beat passed. Then she stepped forward. No translator, no buffer, just her hands. It was the first time in Night Court history that a royal speech was delivered entirely in sign. The silence was thunderous. Each gesture from Alarielle spoke louder than words ever could. "I was not broken. I was not cursed. I only needed to be heard. And now, because of my father..." She turned, took his hand. "Because of my mother..." She looked at Celine, who smiled through tears. "I am free, No one spoke, not even the nobles, until the king himself, ruler of blood and shadows, feared by realms, raised his hands and signed the final word, "Proud!" And the room exploded in applause. In the weeks that followed, the palace changed. Sign language was added to royal instruction. Every guard, page and court official was trained in basic fluency. New banners were raised, featuring not only the crest of the Night Court, but the symbol for listen. The kingdom had once ruled through silence. Now it thrived in it. Celine did not change her name. She did not take Varix. She did not lose herself in power or ritual or politics. But she did walk beside him as queen, and she did continue her quiet revolution, not by command, but by example. She spent mornings in the gardens with Alarielle, afternoons teaching village children to sign, and evenings in Varric's arms, sharing stories under moonlight, with no fear of being too small or too mortal. Because now, she wasn't either. And on the night of the full moon, exactly 1 year from the banquet that changed everything, the three of them returned to the garden where it all began. The wine had long been cleaned, the linens replaced, but the moment still lived in the stone, in the roots, in the stars above. Alarielle sat cross-legged on the grass, picking petals from a midnight rose. She looked up. "Happy?" she signed. Varric glanced at Celine. Celine smiled, and together they signed back, slowly, in perfect unison. Forever. Before you go, if this story touched your heart, made you smile, cry, or believe again in the power of love and listening, we'd love for you to be part of our community. Subscribe to our channel for daily uploads of fantasy romance stories like this one, full of emotion, magic, and unforgettable characters. Every day, a new tale. Every night, a new world. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story, or the next one we're writing just for you. Because here, love always finds a way.